Ilana, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'll start now. To begin with, I'd like to say a few words about the topic for our practice session today and about predictions in general. Post-COVID economic outlook is a hot topic today. Um, Everywhere you go, people have ideas about what will happen to the economy, how things will play out, what will or will not happen, what will or will not return to normal pre-pandemic form, whether specific industries will thrive or go extinct, etc. I'm always skeptical about such forecasts, not only about the post pandemic world, but in general, because no one really can see the future. People tend to focus on what's immediately in front of them, and they tend to ignore or simply not be aware of a multitude of relevant factors that may affect the outcome. There are also the proverbial black swans, uh, events that no one could see coming. The pandemic itself is such a black swan. As Yogi Berra famously said, it is difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. So such outlooks or projections range from fortune telling to educated guesses at best. And another thing I'd like to say in this regard is that you should also be very careful with respect to where those predictions come from. So whenever you hear a forecast, stop and think where it's coming from, who is the source. Take, for example, interpreting, which is near and dear to our heart. There is a lot of talk these days about virtual meetings becoming the norm and that in-person conferences will not come back because they're very time consuming, they're very costly, not as efficient, etc. Whether or not this is true remains to be seen. But if you hear someone from an RSI platform such as Zoom or Kudo claiming that in-person meetings would never come back, it is worth keeping in mind that they're interested in this being the case because this is their revenue stream. And so representatives of those platforms have every reason to push for this way of thinking. And so you should probably take this outlook with a grain of salt. So today, I don't want to be yet another prophet who would tell you what will or will not happen to the economy after or as a result of the pandemic. Instead, I would like to talk about a tendency that had started before the pandemic, but was brought to the fore and accelerated by the pandemic. So I'm not sharing with you my views on what I think will happen, but rather I'm discussing what has been happening and how the pandemic affected it. I'm talking about the rise of the union movement in North America. Now, the unions were on the rise before the pandemic. For example, some of you may remember the story about Foodora. It's a food delivery service, a subsidiary of a German company that operated in 10 cities across Canada. The company started working in Canada in 2015 and closed in May last year. So in the fall of 2019, the delivery drivers working for this delivery service voted to unionize with Canadian postal workers. In response, the company argued that delivery drivers are not employees but contractors. However, in February 2020, the Ontario Labor Relations Board rejected that argument by the company and ruled in favor of the workers. So what did the company do? Soon after the ruling, the company announced that as of May 2020, it would shut down its operation in Canada. The company claimed that the competition is too stiff and that they had been unable to turn a profit. And as a result, hundreds of workers lost their jobs in the midst of the pandemic. Many of them did not have any employment records, and it wasn't clear at the time whether or not they would have any access to governmental benefits. Now, the Foodora story that began before the pandemic shows that the power balance is shifting currently towards labor. What does this mean? As you probably know, the economic theory identifies labor and capital as two of the three building blocks of the economy. The third is land, which I'm not going to discuss in my speech today. The relation between labor and capital is often viewed in terms of power, in particular within the Marxist political economy theory. Capital is represented by capitalists who control the means of production, whereas labor is represented by workers who sell their labor or their skills, etc., in exchange for wages. And there is a constant tension between the two, and the power balance shifts periodically from one side to the other. The rise of corporate giants such as Google, Amazon, and many others, growing inequality, the ever-widening gap between middle and low income, all of these signals indicate that the pendulum swinging towards capital. And so it was only a matter of time when we would see it swinging back towards labor, which would manifest itself in, among other things, a much more active union movement. These tidal waves have been observed since at least the Industrial Revolution. So the current pandemic was not the culprit behind it. Nonetheless, the pandemic did play a role in the sense that it has accelerated the shift, made it more urgent. During the lockdown, the need for delivery services skyrocketed, as we all know. People need food, but people also need household items, technology, because people work from home and they need things they normally would not have kept at home, would not have worried about them. Also, people shop more because they're bored, because they have more time to browse the web. So more workers are needed, more delivery drivers, warehouse workers, etc. There is more work, few and shorter breaks, to make sure that deliveries are done quickly to beat the competition. And because companies, of course, don't want to pay extra. They want to keep their expenses as low as possible while turning a profit. But at the same time, people became more afraid than ever of losing their jobs and are now willing to accept even more unfavorable terms. So you see that people feel more vulnerable. They feel that they've been painted into a corner. They're angrier. And this is a recipe for a flammable brew. Amazon has been known for some time for its harsh working conditions and low pay. And at the same time, the company cleaned up pretty nicely during the pandemic. So you may remember that Amazon made headlines about a month ago with a crazy story about its workers having to pee in bottles because they didn't have time for a proper break. Now, at first, the Amazon management tried to deny it. They said, if that were true, nobody would work for us. And as it turned out, this was a big PR mistake because in response, Twitter was flooded with accounts from the workers who actually did have to use empty water bottles as their portable washroom. And I'm sure you have heard that a few days ago, Amazon workers in a warehouse in Alabama voted against forming a union. About 53% of the workers voted, and the vote against was overwhelming. 1,798 workers voted against unionizing, and only 738 workers voted in favor. This may look as a ginormous victory for Amazon, but apparently this is not the case. This is only the beginning. Many people say that this was a victory for the workers in the long run, in the sense that no one expected the labor movement to get as far in Alabama as it did. So first of all, this was the biggest attempt to unionize in the entire history of Amazon. And Amazon has been around for over 25 years. And this was the second time that a vote happened. And you should also keep in mind that in Alabama, legislation does not favor workers. And on top of that, we're talking about a giant, one of the biggest on the planet, if not the biggest, against its workers. So if you consider all those factors, in the long run, this may be a victory for the union movement in Alabama and in North America in general. Because it is unlikely that the Amazon workers or workers at other corporations would feel that they're not treated fairly, would simply abandon their efforts. Given that the pandemic has been a catalyst for these efforts, we will likely see that the return to labor-centered economy in the post-pandemic world would proceed at a different pace. compared to what we witnessed in the past. Or those efforts could be qualitatively different. Labor leaders might opt for different political strategies to mobilize workers. For example, labor leaders might capitalize on the idea that workers were not given proper consideration during the pandemic. So this is the prediction bit of my speech. I won't go further than that. Now, before I conclude my remarks, I remember it was suggested last time that I should include, it would be a good thing if I include a personal note towards the end of my speech. So here you go. I know firsthand that unions are a double-edged sword. They can certainly be a bad thing, and here's how I know that. As some of you know, I spent several years teaching at different universities in Canada. And in particular, when I was teaching at York University as a contract faculty, I was covered by CUPE 3903. And in this particular case, the union negotiated for its members something that's called seniority, or a seniority clause. So what does this mean? Suppose I'm applying for a job, for a teaching job at York, and I've never taught at York. And someone else is applying for the same teaching job, but this person has experience teaching at York as a contract faculty. So the fact that this person had taught at York before automatically gives him advantage over me. Just the fact that the person has taught before, nothing else is considered. The problem is that it is virtually impossible to get rid of this person once they are in. So what you often see as a result is that university courses are taught by PhD dropouts, those who are not qualified because of their professional background, because they're poor communicators, and because they're outright irresponsible people. They're late for classes, they're not responsive to students' needs, etc. They may be incompetent on so many levels, but because they have precedence, because they have seniority, it would take so much effort and resources on the part of the department to get rid of these people that it's easier to leave them alone. And the students in the meantime are paying the same exorbitant tuition for being taught by those semi-qualified or unqualified people. And yet, I believe what's happening at Amazon and other corporations is outrageous. I can't fight it on a global scale, but I can do my part. For example, I never shop on Amazon. For electronics, for example, I use Staples. I try to use Canadian suppliers whenever possible. Yes, I do pay higher prices. I have longer wait times. I have to contend with a more lengthy and cumbersome return procedure. But I'm willing to do this because I don't want to support Amazon. I think Amazon will be just fine without me. There is no such thing as a free lunch. So remember, if you're paying significantly less for something, it means that the other portion of the price tag is being shouldered by someone else, probably the workers who don't even have time to go on a break and use the washroom. I also don't go to Loblaws. For those of you who are not from our neck of the woods, this is a huge corporation, supermarket chains. I'm lucky. I live in an area where I can go to small family-owned grocery shops and a farmer's market. So I have this option and I use it. Higher prices mean that you buy only what you need. So this is an upside. When you're paying less, then there is always this temptation to buy more stuff. Now, this does not mean that I believe I can change the world or bring down Amazon or other corporations. I have no illusions about this. So this is not about changing the world. On a daily basis, this is about not participating in something I don't like. But in the long run, I believe this is also my opportunity to not simply make predictions about the post-pandemic economy, but actually shape it as a consumer and as a human being. Thank you.